I yield. Mr. President, I notice the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Alexander. No more votes in the Senate today, and when they go out tonight, the chamber's adjourning for 2 weeks for the Thanksgiving holiday. Before voting on the adjournment resolution, a vote on whether to advance the defense programs bill failed. The Senate has been debating the $626 billion bill much of the week, spending most of the legislative day yesterday on sexual assaults in the military. In a joint statement, House Armed Services Chairman Buck McKeon and Ranking Member Adam Smith said that time is running short to finish the Pentagon policy bill, which has been passed by Congress for 51 straight years. The Hill writes that House leaders said the bill could still get done even if the Senate does not pass the measure until December. When the Senate returns from its 2-week recess in December, the House and Senate will only have 1 week in session together before the House is scheduled to adjourn. Earlier today, the Senate voted to change the rules to allow most judicial and executive nominations to advance with a 51-vote simple majority. Until today, nominations could be blocked with a 60-vote threshold. And you can give us your thoughts about the change in filibuster rules at facebook.com/cspan.
The senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, I would ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, to follow up on some of the comments I made earlier about the D.C. Circuit, there have been accusations, and I guess everybody has their perspective, but the accusations seem to be that Republicans, for ideological reasons, want to fill these judgeship slots. But I would say to my colleagues, truly, if these judgeship slots were necessary and needed, and these nominees were up, I believe all three of them would be confirmed. If they were nominated for other circuits, I believe they would be confirmed, although I'm not saying there aren't objections to some of them, but I don't think this question we're dealing with has to do with the quality of the judges. And the reason I'm saying that is because I felt like that this action in not filling these judgeships should not be offensive to my colleagues because it wasn't based on a rejection of President Obama's nominees, based on the fact that we were too strict in our evaluation of whoever he's nominated. I have voted probably 90% of President Obama's judges, well over 80 I know, and the President had confirmed over 200 judges. I earlier said 250, I think maybe it's over 200, and only 2 have been denied confirmation. So these 3 judges have been appointed to a circuit, and the caseload has been falling, and it's already by far the lowest caseload in the country based on the 8 judges now that are active in that circuit. And adding 3 more judges would bring that caseload down substantially further and create an even more underemployed court. And we don't need to do it, especially when we have courts around the country that do need more judges, more district judges and circuit judges, but there are some circuit judge slots that need to be filled. So I would say that out of respect to my colleagues. But it was a cause for concern that the President and other supporters of his judicial vision have openly stated their goal for filling these slots is to advance their agenda. President Obama says, quote, "We are remaking the courts." Senator Schumer, "Our strategy will be to nominate 4 more people for each of those vacancies. We will fill up the D.C. circuit one way or the other." Close quote. One way or the other. No limit to what we'll do to fill these slots that are not needed. Senator Harry Reid switched to majority. The people don't focus much on the D.C. circuit. It is, some say, more important than even the Supreme Court. I've heard conservatives somewhat make that statement. That is totally wrong. It's not that important a circuit. It's an important circuit. Occasionally key administrative rulings get filed in the D.C. circuit and they never get appealed to the Supreme Court. Their decision may be final on some administrative power, but it is not equivalent to the Supreme Court, nowhere close. And you can see it based on how few cases they actually handle. Senator Reid goes on to say, we need at least 1 more. There are 3 vacancies. We need at least 1 more, and that will switch the majority. Apparently, he's saying there's a division within the circuit and 1 vote majority for a more restrained view of the administrative rulings that the court deals with sometimes, and a group that's more activist. And he wants to switch that majority. And a bunch of others have said the same thing. They've said it, Doug Kendall, a liberal activist, with legislative priorities gridlocked in Congress. Get this. They want the court to advance their political agenda that cannot be passed in the Congress. Let me repeat that. The liberal activist goal is to advance an agenda that cannot be passed by the United States Congress, the duly elected representatives. I remember Harding Carter, who served President Jimmy Carter, and then went on one of the morning Sunday talk shows, Meet the Press or something, and he was one of the regular guests and hosts, and he said one time, we Democrats and liberals have got to just admit it. We want the courts to do for us that which we cannot win at the ballot box. And judges shouldn't be doing that. So that's what Mr. Kendall says. He says, with legislative gridlock in Congress, the President's best hope for advancing his agenda is through executive action, and that runs through the D.C. Circuit. Nan Aaron, long active in advocating activist federal judges, said this, quote, this court is critically important. The majority has made decisions that frustrated the President's agenda. Well, so the President is being pressured by a lot of these special interests, and there are others, that advocating these kind of actions, but the court is a court that's well constituted to do its duty, and it will continue to do so, and needs no more judges, and we don't have the money to fill it. We don't have the money to spend on it just to allow him to pack the court with some of his nominees that will more likely advance an agenda, at least he and his activist friends seem to favor. Now, when I came to the Senate, senators on both sides of the aisle got to offer amendments. And I remember Senator Specter, who was then a Republican, independent Republican, a great senator who loved the Senate, switched parties and became a Democrat. We were right down there on the floor, and he was managing the health bill, and I had something I wanted him to accept as part of the manager's package, and he didn't want to do it. And I asked him again, he didn't want to do it. And I asked him again, and he didn't want to do it. I wanted him to agree because I didn't want to offer the amendment and have Senator Specter oppose it because I figured I'd lose the vote. And so I asked him, and he finally got irritated with me bugging him, and he said, you are a United States Senator. If you want to offer your amendment, offer your amendment. That's the way it was when I came to the Senate. You didn't like something, you could offer your amendment. But the manager of the bill had a lot of respect from the colleagues, and if the managers urged people not to vote for it, you were likely not to win, but at least you could get a vote. If you promised your constituents back home you believed in something and you were going to fight for it, you could at least get a vote even if you lost. You could tell people you did that, and then you could hold people accountable for just voting against what some people might like and others would oppose, and people would know where senators stand. We've had a dramatic reduction in the number of votes, really significant. And it started, I think, in maybe the late 90s. I know Senator Frist filled the tree a number of times, not many over his time here, but Senator Reid has just exploded this process. And the perfect example is this defense bill. It was on the floor all week. And we've normally had at least 25 or 30 votes on the defense bill. We spend $500 billion in that authorization. It's a lot of concerns and interest about how defense money and policies over sexual abuse or other issues relevant to the military. Those are important issues that people have concerns about and are willing to vote on. Why shouldn't they be able to get a vote? Really? Why should they not be able to get a vote? So we started this debate. Some of the new colleagues that got elected in 2012, they particularly wanted to change the rules of the Senate and demanded that we do better. And I raised the question of what the majority leader has been doing. And let's take this defense bill I mentioned. What did he do? He stands up, he gets the right of first recognition in the Senate, and there are only a certain number of amendments that can be put out on the amendment tree, and he fills all those slots. We call it filling the tree. And then no one else can get an amendment up that the majority leader doesn't approve. It's really unbelievable. And like frogs in warming water, we don't even realize the pan we're in is about got us cooked. We got members on our side that have been awfully unwilling or have missed what's happening to us. And of course, I guess half of our members, even on the Republican side, were not here when all this started. All they've known is this process. So Senator Reid fills the tree. And so he says he approves two amendments, two sexual abuse amendments for the military. And that's all we've had all week. And he immediately files cloture. He immediately files to shut off debate. And when he does that, he then says we're filibustering, Mr. President. He's saying that's a filibuster. And he is not going to, and he's going to file for cloture and demand that we grant cloture and move the bill without any amendments. And this is unacceptable. So Republicans say we're not going to end debate on the bill till we have a legitimate opportunity to file amendments to the Defense Authorization Bill and actually vote on some of the key issues facing America's national security and our men and women in uniform. We want a robust ability. No. Well, submit a few amendments. Well, that's too many. And we're not going to vote on that one. I don't like that one. I don't like that one. I don't like that one. No, you can't get a vote on that. Our members don't want to vote on that. You can only have a constricted number. And so we have this spectacle of members of the United States Senate, the United States senators from great states all over America, and hat in hand, but bowing before the majority leader, pleading that he allow them to have their amendment up for a vote. And it's really not right. It is an alteration of the whole concept of the free and open debate the Senate is all about. I truly believe that it is. And we're going to have to stop it. And I blame myself. I've complained about this probably as much or maybe more than anyone on our side, but I haven't really taken the action maybe that we need to take to begin to confront this issue. So when my new young colleagues and I were discussing this, one of them said, why, we even have to ask Senator McConnell to get his permission to offer our amendment. Well, how could this happen? How could a United States senator from one of the great states of America be in a position, a Democratic senator, he has a majority in the Senate, how could he be in a position to have to seek Senator McConnell's approval to get an amendment up? Well, the answer is this. Senator Reid tells Senator McConnell, I'm not going to have all of these amendments. We're only going to have 5 amendments. And you can't have this one, and this one. And what are your amendments, Senator McConnell says to Senator Reid? And he says, well, these are the amendments we want to offer. And Senator McConnell said, well, you've restricted my amendments. I don't want to vote on those 2 amendments of your 5. You're going to have to pull those down. So in a sense, that young senator was telling me the truth. I suspect Senator Reid goes back and says, Senator so-and-so, Senator McConnell's objecting to your amendment. We can't get it up. Well, why can't you get it up? I mean, the very idea that a United States senator from New York has got to ask a senator from Kentucky whether or not he can have an amendment is contrary to the approach of the Senate. And so this is filling the tree, is altering the whole process. And again and again and again, Senator Reid takes the floor, he fills the tree, he limits amendments, he files cloture immediately, and those of us who say, no, we're not going to agree to shut off debate through cloture, because you haven't allowed us to have a legitimate chance to offer amendments, and we vote against cloture, and he says, you're filibustering the bill. And he adds all these up, and he says the Republicans, to an unprecedented degree, are filibustering when all it is a reaction to his railroading tactics that have never been used to this degree in the history of the Senate. And I remember, and Senator McCain was quite correct in pointing out the switching of positions that Senator Reid now takes when he was opposing this kind of tactic before, and supporting filibusters. He's now taking the exact opposite. So, with regard to our judicial issues, the Democrats went into retreat in 2000 and decided to change the ground rule. I believe Senator Reid was involved in that, and Senator Schumer was one of the organizers, according to the New York Times. And he said, we're going to change the ground rules. And they started immediately and held 10 federal judge nominees of President Bush, virtually the first 10, to the courts of appeals and filibustered them. We'd never seen anything like that. And now, according to this little document I have, Senator Schumer says that we're going to confirm these judges one way or the other. And if you're using the right to filibuster that I pioneered, that Senator Reid pioneered, if you use those rights, now that we have the majority, we're going to change the rules with a simple majority. And we're not going to allow these judges to be blocked, even though that we have no need for one of them. And we're going to ram it through, and we're going to make the taxpayers pay for it, $1 million a year, one way or the other. So that's where we are. And I don't believe it's good. I'm not a postmodernist. I believe we need to be consistent in our principles. We need to defend the history of the Senate. And I don't believe you can change it one year and change it back the next and act like nothing significant happened. I believe there is a truth. And I believe that there are values that need to be consistently upheld, at least at a minimum, so that this Senate can function. And Senator Reid has got to stop this process. He cannot continue to dominate the Senate, the likes of which it never happened before. There is no one-man dictator in this Senate. And we need to say no. That's just the way it is. It is no way the majority leader of the Senate of the United States should be dominating this body like it's happening today and going to the ultimate of changing the rules like was done today. So I feel strongly about that. We're going to continue to talk about that. We have an institution to preserve. Senator Byrd would never have allowed this to happen, as Senator McCain said, the historian of the Senate who explained to us this great Senate's history. When I first came here, he lectured to both parties and new members about what it's all about. And the love he had for this institution is strong. And I happened to have the honor earlier today to hear Senator Levin talk about this. He's leaving this body. He's a great senator, smart. I have been so impressed how he's handled the Armed Services Committee, on which I'm a member, and he's the chairman. And he gets virtually unanimous votes on the authorization bill. And the only reason we had no votes on the bill that's on the floor today in committee was because they marked the spending level above what the Budget Control Act says. We shouldn't have done that. We spent, under that proposal, we'd spend more money than we're allowed to spend under law, but it was done. But otherwise, all the differences were freely discussed. We had multiple amendments. Senator Levin is very precise. He allows people to make amendments. He suggests compromise. He allows people time to discuss with staff, come back, amend, agree, disagree, and finally have your vote. And it creates good spirit. And it creates a committee that even on legislation as important as this can pass unanimously out of committee. I believe last year the bill was unanimous out of Armed Services Committee, which is hard to achieve in any legislative body. So, Mr. President, this is a dark day. I'm disappointed where we are, and this is a matter that can't just be forgotten. It won't be forgotten. We don't need to act precipitously, but we need to make clear that for the Senate to work, individual senators of both parties have to be free to offer amendments. That clearly needs to be so. And that certain rights a minority party might have cannot be eroded any time they become effective to frustrating the majority leader's desire to advance certain pieces of legislation or nominees. This is not going away. We'll keep discussing it. I hope and pray that we'll be able to reach some sort of solution that puts us back on the right path. I would yield the floor. And note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator Sessions giving his thoughts on what happened in the Senate today, the change in filibuster rules. And you can see more about that on our companion network, C-SPAN, this evening and in our overnight schedule. And at just after 8 Eastern tonight, we'll take your calls about that. On CQ Roll Call, writing that the Senate's historic decision to change its rules could have a dramatic domino effect on the judicial nominations process and potentially even on the judiciary itself, according to legal experts and advocates in both parties. The story goes on to say that weakening the power of the filibuster to block judicial nominees on the Senate floor could bring far more obstruction of those nominees at the committee level, experts say. The rules change could lead to the elimination of the long-established blue slip process of home state senators signing off on presidential choices for the judiciary. It could also prompt the presidents to select more ideological judicial nominees in the first place and encourage some older judges to avoid retirement if they believe that a president from the other party will be able to hastily replace them. That in CQ Roll Call. With the Senate being out tomorrow, we'll have live coverage here on C-SPAN 2 of an event hosted by the National Journal on the effect of the financial crisis on the American middle class. That's in the morning at 10 Eastern. And the Alliance for Health Reform looks at the health insurance exchanges 8 weeks into their existence. That's also on C-SPAN 2 at 12:15 Eastern.
Senator from New York.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that as if in legislative session, the Senate proceed to the consideration of S. 1774, a bill to reauthorize the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988 for 1 year, introduced earlier today, that the bill be read 3 times and passed, and the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. Our colleagues, this is not a good day to move forward with this legislation. We'll be glad to give it serious attention. I know it's the kind of thing we probably can clear at some point, but I would object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Senator from New York.
I appreciate my friend from Alabama, my gym mate and friend and colleague's remarks. I would simply say this. This is simply a renewal of a bill that has passed the Senate unanimously several times before. These days, technology has allowed us to make undetectable firearms, no metal. They can get right through a metal detector. I'd like to improve on this bill, but because it expires by December 9th, right before we get back, I was hoping that we could simply pass the existing law that's on the books. I'm afraid that won't happen. I understand why my colleague from Alabama objected, why he did. I hope that as soon as we come back, we might get this body to pass it, and maybe the House get to pass it. We're in a dangerous world, and to allow terrorists, criminals, those who are mentally infirm to walk through metal detectors with guns that are made of plastic and then use them at airports, at sporting events, in schools is a very bad thing. What makes us need to do this rather quickly is that a few months ago, someone in Texas published on the website a way to make a plastic gun, buying a 3D printer for less than $1,000. There were over 200,000 copies, hits on that website. People hit the website then. So we have to move quickly here. I hope we can move as soon as we get back. I do understand my colleagues' objection tonight, given everything that's happened today, but we cannot wait, and I hope nobody will object to this bill. I have some worries that people might, but let's hope not. It's serious stuff. And with that, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
We see a tweet there from Mike Crapo, Senator Crapo, saying that today invoking the nuclear option is a terrible thing for the Senate, but more importantly for the entire country. The Senate today voted to change the chamber's filibuster rules for most executive branch and judicial nominations. It would allow the nominations to advance with a simple majority of 51 votes instead of a 60-vote supermajority. Doing this limits the minority party's ability to prevent confirmation of presidential nominees. Senators Carl Levin of Michigan, Mark Pryor of Arkansas, and Joe Manchin of West Virginia were the only Democrats to vote against the rules change.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak on the National Defense Authorization Act and an amendment that I have filed, Amendment number 2903, which supports the Next Generation Long-Range Strike Bomber. And I hope that we do get back on the defense bill. This amendment, like many of the amendments that have been filed to this bill, is both germane and non-controversial. As has been the past practice with the Defense Authorization Bill, my amendment should be included in a manager's package that could be passed by unanimous consent. In the past, when the Senate has considered the National Defense Authorization Act, we've had an average of around 11 recorded votes. That's the historical average. And this year, so far, we've had 2. For amendments included by voice vote or unanimous consent, anywhere from 80 to 100 amendments tends to be the norm. In other words, that's the number of amendments that we process, not necessarily have recorded votes on, but amendments that are offered to the bill that are handled in one way or another but end up getting added to the legislation. For amendments, for this year I should say, we haven't even been able to have a manager's package which would include many of these non-controversial amendments. Now, I support the Senator Inhofe, who was the ranking Republican on the Armed Services Committee, and my Republican colleagues here in the Senate in the approach that they've taken while this bill's been on the floor. Considering this bill, there needs to be an open amendment process. And we're not talking, as I said, about the hundreds of amendments that have been filed, but a reasonable number should be considered on the Senate floor. Everyone here is aware of the time constraints we're under, but that is not an excuse for bypassing an open amendment process on this important piece of legislation. Mr. President, as the Senate debates the annual defense authorization bill, our military continues to face increasing budget constraints. These budget constraints have forced our military to prioritize and to develop ways to increase efficiency and to reduce spending. As we look ahead, the Department of Defense must continue to focus on ways to best prepare for the threats our country will face in the future. On all fronts, these future threats will require an increasingly mobile force that relies on speed and technology to reach conflict points around the world. With regard to the Air Force, this means a modernization of our current fleet. According to General Welch, the Chief of Staff for the Air Force, the next generation long-range strike bomber is one of the top 3 procurement programs our Air Force must pursue to modernize our fleet and to meet future challenges. The other 2, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter and the KC-46 aerial refueling tanker, are currently underway. The next generation bomber, which General Welch has called, and I quote, a must-have capability, will ensure our ability to operate effectively in anti-access and area denial environments. As potential adversaries continue to modernize their anti-aircraft systems, our ability to penetrate those systems must modernize as well. The Department of Defense has already begun investing, I should say, in the research and development phase for the next generation bomber. In the meantime, our current bomber fleets of B-2s, B-1s, and B-52s continue to provide robust deterrent and long-range strike capabilities. The upgrades, which are currently being made to these aircraft, allow them to operate in the modern environment. However, as this fleet continues to age into the mid-2020s, the next generation bomber will need to come online. My home state of South Dakota is home to the 28th Bomb Wing, which commands 2 of 3 combat squadrons operating the B-1B strategic bomber. The men and women of the 28th Bomb Wing have bravely defended our country in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in 2011, the B-1 played a key role in Operation Odyssey Dawn, launching from Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, dropping munitions in Libya, and returning home in one continuous flying mission. This operation marked the first time the B-1 launched combat sorties from the continental United States to strike targets overseas, and it exemplifies the B-1's crucial flexibility and capability to project conventional air power on short notice anywhere in the world. Of the 3 aircraft in our bomber fleet, the B-1B has the highest payload, the fastest maximum speed, and operates at the lowest cost per flying hour. As I've said before, the B-1 is the workhorse of our United States Air Force. Mr. President, as the R&D continues for the next generation bomber, the Air Force has already identified many essential capabilities to this aircraft. According to the Air Force, the next generation bomber should be usable across the spectrum of conflict, from isolated strikes to prolonged campaigns. It should provide the commander-in-chief the option to strike a target at any point on the globe, and it must be able to penetrate modern air defenses despite an adversary's anti-aircraft systems. In terms of payload, it must be capable of carrying a wide mix of standoff and direct attack munitions and have the option for either nuclear or conventional capability. As part of the strategy for development, the next generation bomber should allow for the integration of mature technologies and existing systems, taking into account the capabilities of other weapon systems to reduce program complexity. While developing the next generation bomber will not be easy, the Air Force has learned several important lessons from its most recent procurement efforts. The Department of Defense has already streamlined requirements and oversight to ensure a timely decision-making process for the next generation bomber. This initiative has included efforts to reduce costs for the overall program with the goal of preventing cost overruns which have plagued previous acquisition programs. The Department of Defense already knows the importance of this program, Mr. President. As outlined in the 2015 to 2019 Program Objective Memorandum, the Air Force intends to prioritize the development and acquisition of the long-range strike bomber over the next several years. As the Air Force continues to modernize, the long-range strike bomber remains a must-have capability for future combat operations. So this amendment, Mr. President, is very straightforward. I hope that we get back on the defense authorization bill. I hope we have an open amendment process. I hope that amendments like this, which are germane and non-controversial, can be included in a manager's package of amendments or at least considered on the floor by my colleagues in the United States Senate. It is essential, Mr. President, in light of the many challenges that we faced around the globe today, the potential adversaries that are out there, the threats that exist as we look out over the horizon, that we make every preparation, take every necessary step to ensure that our country can defend ourselves and our allies around the world. American interests, American national security interests are always at stake. And it is important for us to be investing wisely in those types of weapon capabilities that can ensure that the United States is prepared for whatever contingency might develop around the world. And so I hope that we will get back on the defense authorization bill, allow amendments to be considered, as they have been in the past. Whenever we've processed defense bills in the past, Mr. President, we've had a process that has allowed for consideration of many amendments, as I said before, 80 to 100 in most cases, and multiple roll call votes, way more than we've had on this bill so far. But it is important to the men and women who wear the uniform of the United States military that this be a priority for us. It should be a priority for our country, and I hope that we can get the bill on the floor, process amendments, pass it, and get it on the President's desk where it can be signed into law. Mr. President, I yield the floor. The absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The National Journal writes that with the rules changes in the Senate today, filibusters on executive branch and lower court judicial nominees are gone. But this change, importantly, does not include picks for the Supreme Court. Senator Reid's move to effectively close a decade-long debate on appropriating filibusters of nominees, especially those tapped for the D.C. Circuit Court. Dems quickly took advantage of their new authority, voting to end the filibuster on Patricia Millett's nomination to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And if you have reaction to the filibuster rules change, you can give us your comments at facebook.com/cspan. The Senate is not in tomorrow and will be back after 2 weeks off for the Thanksgiving break. Some of our live coverage here on C-SPAN 2 tomorrow, an event hosted by the National Journal on the effect of the financial crisis on the American middle class. That's tomorrow morning at 10 Eastern here on C-SPAN 2. And the Alliance for Health Reform looks at the health insurance exchanges 8 weeks after they started, also here on C-SPAN 2 at 12:15 Eastern.
President,
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the call of quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the period of morning business. Senators allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I'm told there are 4 bills at the desk due for a first reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bills for the first time.
S-1774, a bill to reauthorize the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988 for 1 year. S-1775, a bill to improve the sexual assault prevention and response programs and activities of the Department of Defense and for other purposes. H.R. 1965, an act to streamline and ensure onshore energy permitting and so forth and for other purposes. H.R. 2728, an act to recognize states' authority to regulate oil and gas operations and promote American energy security, development, and job creation.
I ask for second reading en bloc and object to my own request en bloc.
Objection having been heard, the bills will be read for a second time on the next legislative day.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that during the adjournment or recess of the Senate from Thursday, November 21st through Monday, December 9th, Senators Warner, Keene, and Rockefeller be authorized to sign duly enrolled bills or resolutions.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that appointments at the desk appear separately in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn and convene for pro forma sessions only.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I apologize. I ask consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn and convene for pro forma sessions only with no business conducted on the following dates and times. And following each pro forma session, the Senate adjourn until the next pro forma session. Friday, November 22nd, 11:15 a.m., Tuesday, November 26th at 11 a.m., Friday, November 29th at 1 p.m., Tuesday, December 3rd at 11 a.m., and Friday, December 6th at 10:30 a.m. And that the Senate adjourn on Friday, December 6th until 2 p.m. on Monday, December 9th. Unless the Senate receives a message from the House that is adopted as Conres 28.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Further, I request that if the Senate receives such a message, Senate adjourn until 2 p.m. on Monday, December 9th, 2013, that on Monday following the prayer and the pledge of the morning hour be deemed expired. Journal proceedings be approved today. The time for the 2 leaders be reserved for use later in the day. Now, following any leader remarks, the Senate be in a period of morning business until 4 p.m. The Senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each. Following morning business, Senate resumed consideration of S-1197, the National Defense Authorization Act, to allow the chairman and ranking member to provide a status update on the bill. Further, at 5 p.m., the Senate proceeded to executive session for consideration of calendar number 327, the nomination of Patricia Millett to be a United States Circuit Judge for the D.C. Circuit post-cloture. With up to 30 minutes of debate equally divided and controlled in the usual form. And finally, at 5:30 p.m.,